Hello everyone, I want to welcome you all to this workshop. The title of this workshop is Continuous Integration, Continuous Deployment 101 with CircleCI. And this workshop is essentially an introductory workshop where I will be demonstrating how developers can easily implement continuous delivery pipelines into their Python application projects. Before we get into the workshop, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Angel Riviera. I'm a developer advocate for CircleCI, and my job at CircleCI is to essentially engage the developer community and understand how developers are using technology, some of their pain points in using technology, right? And then bringing that information back to CircleCI so that we can build more valuable features for developers based off of that information. Now, I'm super excited to be here today because workshops are one of my favorite things to do. So let's go ahead and jump into the workshop. So what I'm showing you here is basically a code example for a simple Python Flask application. The application shouldn't be your focus at this time. Because what I want to really focus in on is the creation of a CICD pipeline within a specific project. So again, I'm using this project to kind of demonstrate or very simply demonstrate how you can easily implement continuous delivery pipelines into your existing or new projects using CircleCI. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to set up a Docker Hub account. And the reason why we want to do that is this pipeline that I'm going to show you is going to specifically build a Docker image and then push it to Docker Hub. So if you go to hub.docker.com, which is right here, go ahead and register for an account if you don't have one already. That way we can get the credentials that we're going to need to programmatically push the Docker image that we're going to build within our pipeline. Once you log in and register for your account, just go ahead and jump over to your account settings. And in this case, you can jump over to security and just create a new access token as such. Give it a name, and then create it. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate that. I don't know, let's just call it test token. And then we're going to create it. Once you have that token, essentially it's right here. Just copy it off and paste it somewhere because we're going to use that in the next step of our CircleCI project. So we created our Docker Hub API token. And again, hopefully you save that off, somewhere, because we're going to use it later on in this project. So first, let's go ahead and go to CircleCI.com. And from there, your sign-up process will look a little different. I already am a member of CircleCI, so I'm just going to log right in. But if you don't have, this already wired up, the setup process is pretty easy. Just go ahead to CircleCI sign up, and I'll demonstrate that real quick. I'll just sign out so that you can see what I'm talking about. And then you just click go to app or CircleCI.com. You'll be presented with this, right? Either log into CircleCI if you already have an account, or you can just click the sign up button. And essentially what this is going to do is connect your CircleCI account with either your GitHub or your Bitbucket version control accounts. I'm going to use GitHub for this demonstration. Once I click that, since I'm already associated with with CircleCI in my project on GitHub, the project is already listed. You will probably be presented with a different screen, which will ask you to create the CircleCI.config file, right? Or at least have a generic one in there to initiate an initial build. right now I already have that in place. So I'm just going to go ahead and filter all of these other, all these other projects out. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code. Once you have, everything wired up, you want to essentially ensure that your project has the Docker Hub environment variables before we kick anything off. And I'm going to show you how to build a configuration file from scratch within the project momentarily. I just want to show you before we get too far down the rabbit hole what to do with those credentials that we created in Docker Hub. What I'm going to do here is basically, let me go back one and show you that again. So we have this, Python CICD workshop. What you want to do is, click on this project settings button here. And then we're going to go ahead and look for the environment variables. So what we're doing here is essentially setting environment variables for our project. And this is, again, the environment variables are your Docker Hub credentials, your API token, and your username. By the way, these are protected on the platform at rest and in flight. So whenever they're used within a CI/CD build or build execution or pipeline execution, these things are very well protected, again, within the system at rest, and then also while they're transmitted to the runtime in flight. So let's go ahead and I already have my environment variables defined. And all you really have to do is just click on this button here and essentially just give it a name. This one, because we're using an orb, we actually need to type out Docker login, right? That needs to be the actual environment variable name, or else our Docker orb will not work, which I'll explain what an orb is later. And then we have to put our value for that, which is essentially your Docker Hub username. My Docker Hub username is ARIV3RA. So I'll put that. I would add that, but it's already there. So just click the add environment variable. It should show up in your list just like this. And then you have to do it again and essentially type in the Docker password environment variable. Again, you need to be very specific here and have it all caps _password. And then in the values field, basically paste in that API token that you initially retrieved from the previous step. Make sure that there are no spaces before or after the value that you paste. Sometimes that happens and it takes the values exactly as you input them. So please be cognizant of any spaces. Once you have all of that in place and your environment variable screen for your project looks like this, you can just click this X and we're back to the pipeline dashboard. Again, your pipeline dashboard is going to look different from mine because I've obviously been working with this project. So let's go ahead and jump back over to the configuration file that basically defines our CI/CD pipelines within CircleCI. Again, the .CircleCI directory within your repository must contain a config.yaml file in order for CircleCI to know what to execute in regards to a CI/CD pipeline. So a little bit about this configuration file. It essentially uses a YAML syntax in order for us to define our CI/CD pipelines. YAML is not a programming language. It's essentially a data structure which has very declarative properties. So you can easily define things that you want to occur within CircleCI using the YAML syntax, and CircleCI interprets this file and then executes on what you've defined in CI/CD pipelines. So the first thing we want to do when we're defining our pipelines is to essentially define what version of CircleCI we want to use. So CircleCI 2.1 is the latest version. So we're going to go ahead and essentially put our version number key, right? So it is YAML, so we have to basically have a key called version, and then the value is 2.1. So now you're telling CircleCI execute anything in this YAML file using the 2.1 version of the platform. The next key that we have in our YAML configuration is what we call an orbs key. Now, orbs are essentially encapsulated functionality or abstracted functionality. It's very similar to packaged configuration. So we are going to use Docker in this example. And what we're going to do is leverage what we call the Docker orb. And basically, it's essentially packaged up YAML and configuration that we use at CircleCI. So it just helps with basically making things more consistent, or executing things more consistently, reliantly, and then also being able to essentially manage the functionality from these orbs. I'll show you real quick the CircleCI orbs registry. So that basically is like an NPM package management kind of platform. So if we go to circleci.com, we go to developer, and you can see here orbs. And this will basically, again, it's just reusable configuration that helps with like you not having to write a lot of unnecessary code. We do have a registry, so you can start searching for things. I'm going to go ahead and look up the Docker orb, which is this one. And what we're going to do here is essentially leverage some of the things that are here. I will demonstrate later on what we're going to use from this orb. But as you can see here, right, there's different elements to a CircleCI configuration. But essentially, it boils down to 3 different elements, which are jobs, commands, and executors. Executors are where you're running your code. There's a couple different flavors. We have what we call a machine executor, which is essentially your pipeline will run in a full-on machine runtime. And then we have the commands, which essentially are the things you want to execute. And they're usually listed in like a steps call here. So here's a nice example of like commands, right? And then finally, a job element, right, within your pipeline. Those are essentially groupings of things you want to execute, or commands you want to execute. So a job is just basically putting a label together, like let's say Docker publish, and which essentially will, take your built Docker image and then publish it to whatever Docker repository you want to use. We're going to be using Docker Hub for this example. But again, right, we have jobs, commands, executors, and then there's another element called workflows, which I'm going to show you a little bit later. So I kind of wanted to describe orbs. I think I've done that. Let's go back to our code so we can start defining things properly. So here we go. We have the orbs key, right? So we're going to use, so this is almost like an import statement, right? Like, so we're saying, hey, we're going to use orbs in this configuration. We're going to use the CircleCI Docker version 1.5. And this Docker key here is essentially just a kind of a reference key. You can say Docker here, or you can say Docker orb, whatever you want. It's up to you. I prefer to use Docker just to be a little bit clearer. But once we have this defined, so now we have this this built, or at least defined in our config. The next step is what I like to do is define jobs. So let's go ahead and define a jobs key here. And then from there, we're going to go ahead and implement a few more things. So YAML is very space sensitive. So you need to be able to, create things and indent them properly. Otherwise, you will get some indenting errors or some build errors. And YAML is very space sensitive, so you have to indent things properly. So the first thing we're going to do is build a list of jobs. I like to test my software. So what we're going to do is test that Flask application, and we're going to build a what I call build test job. So let me go ahead and grab all this stuff, and then we'll talk about what all these things do. So let me go ahead and show you. Basically, what I'm doing here is creating a new job called build test, which is here. Of course, since it's kind of a list object or map, we're going to have to define what we call an executor, as I mentioned earlier. And in this case, I'm going to use the Docker runtime as my executor. So what I'm doing here is basically running my build inside of a Docker container. Now, since I'm running my build inside of a Docker container, I'm going to need to define an image. And this is just a property of a Docker executor, is to define an image. Again, CircleCI provides what we call convenience images, and I'm going to leverage our CircleCI Python 3.9 image to build my project on. So once we have that defined, our executor and our job name defined, we need to add a couple of commands to the job. So when I'm doing that, what we want to do here is essentially, paste in our steps. So what we're doing is defining steps, which are within jobs. Steps are just a list of commands that need to be, or that are going to be executed within that job. So to clear this all up, the build test job here is essentially, again, the name of our job. So it's defining a job within our config and our CI/CD pipeline. The Docker is the executor, the runtime where all these commands are going to run in. And then the steps are the list of all the commands we're going to execute in this job. So what we have here is a special command that we call checkout, and it's basically an alias for git clone. So this is how your changed code or your modified code gets basically pulled into the runtime. Again, it's an alias for like a git clone. So once we have the code inside of the executor, we can then create a run command. So this is basically a run command. And what that does is essentially executes something, right? Some command. And an element for a run command is name, which is essentially just kind of a label within the dashboard. I'll show you a little bit later. And then the next thing is actually the command key, right? So what we have here is this pipe here is basically signifying a multi-line command. So if you have multiple things, right? I know I only have one here running, but if I just leave it there because I might add something later. But you could actually, add more commands under this. Right now, our command is literally just going to install our dependencies using pip based off of our requirements txt file within the project. Once we have that, we will now be able to run a simple pytest command, right? So the next run command here essentially just kicks off our unit test running using a pytest. So it's pretty simple, what we have here. So what I'd like to do is essentially try to run, have you cut and paste all of this code, and then, try to run this at a later time. But essentially, again, what we're doing here is building a build test job. Now, the next thing I want to do is build another job. And this job is going to be called build push Docker image. So let me grab all the things and bring it over to you. So now we have a build push Docker image job, right, that I defined. And again, we're using the Docker executor, right, with image Python 3.9, which essentially has Python 3.9 installed. And then, of course, we have our special command again, checkout, which basically brings the code in again to our build or to our Docker image in our pipeline. The next step here is we have a run command again, right? And then this time we're calling this build app binary. I like to use this library called PyInstaller so that it can take my Python applications and build them into a single binary that can be deployable right across the board. Obviously, we have to again install our dependencies, and in this case, the next step is going to be that we create that binary using that PyInstaller dependency. Now with PyInstaller, we're just adding an F flag, which basically means create a file. And then from there, we're defining which file to build off of, right? So the starting file for our application, which is hello_world_py. Once we have that defined, since we are building a Docker image within a Docker container, we're going to have to use this special command called setup remote Docker. This setup remote Docker command essentially creates another Docker container that has the Docker client installed and gives us the ability to build what is essentially the concept of building a Docker image from a Docker container, right? So the setup remote Docker essentially does that for us. And then once we have that defined, we're going to start leveraging our orb. Remember this Docker orb that we defined up here in line 3? Now we get to implement it. So in line 28, the way that you use this Docker, for all but lack of a better term, import statement, is to define first say Docker and then /, which then enables you to execute some sort of command or function or job. In this case, we're doing a check just to check, make sure that the image that we have has the Docker client installed. Very simple, just a quick check. Nothing big there. You could or you can or don't have to, right? This is an optional thing. I would recommend just having it as a check step. But this is where things get interesting. Again, we're leveraging the Docker orb, right? And then we're using the build command. So what the build command does is, if you were to build a Docker image from scratch or feed it commands, it would have you would have to know how to kind of build that Docker image and understand what the flags are. In this case, since we're building the Docker image using our automation here in our CICD pipeline, we're using our orb. Now the image flag here within the build command signifies that we need to give it this image a name. I am actually using obviously we're going to push this to Docker Hub, so I'm actually using my Docker login environment variable, right, which is we defined a little bit earlier in the workshop. And then I'm giving, the normal Docker naming convention, which is, a /, and then I'm also leveraging CircleCI built-in environment variables. These are environment variables that are defined and specified and available to your pipeline when they are actually running upon execution. The CircleCI _ project repo name environment variable just defines the repo's project name. In this case, it's going to be Python-CICD workshop, right? Because that's the name of the repo. And then because I want to build my Docker image with different names, I giving it the -t, which is a tag, another Docker tag, and then I'm going to give it the Docker login credential, the Docker login _ CircleCI project repo name, right? Finally, there's another tag that I could give it, and in this case, I'm going to also tag my repo or my Docker image with a repository or pipeline number That way, you kind of get that kind of Senver feel. And then you can tie that specific Docker image back to a specific pipeline build. And now if it's not clear right now, it'll be clear later on in the demonstration. So finally, right, we have our Docker image built. The next thing we want to do is create or push this newly built Docker image up to our Docker Hub repository. So we have a push command, right? And essentially, again, right, this is an image tag or an image key that you need to define the image name. In this case, we're going to push our regularly named, Docker image. And then the tag is going to be latest. But I also want to push a tag up to Docker Hub as well with our pipeline number tag, right? Our Senver type tag. So again, we're leveraging the Docker orb to build and then push our different Docker layers or Docker images and tagged images up to Docker Hub. So now that we have the Docker job defined and pretty much ready to go, let's go ahead and now take and create what we call a workflow. So we've defined our jobs. We've defined the things that we want to execute within our CI/CD pipeline. But the next thing we have to think about is, okay, so we have all of these jobs defined. How do we execute them and orchestrate the execution of these jobs? In this case, within CircleCI's platform, that's what we call a workflow. A workflow is a way for you to define how these jobs are going to be executed, right? Or they're going to be orchestrated within your CI/CD pipelines when they're triggered. So let's go ahead and create a workflow for this pipeline. Again, I'm trying to keep this super simple for folks because so I know that everyone's experience varies, but we definitely want to address some of the things that may not be well understood. Because CI/CDs, especially if you're new to it, it's not that simple of a concept to grasp right away, but it isn't that difficult either. So what I've done here, and I'm going to go ahead and collapse these jobs, right? So let's get the jobs out of the way. Let's go ahead and get them fully out of the way. What I want to focus in on now is how to orchestrate those jobs that we define, right? Workflows is a key that must be defined within your CI/CD pipeline. And again, workflows is just a list of orchestration, job orchestration lists or execution commands. So we have a workflow. Now we need to create it's a workflow. It's a workflows list. Now we need to create and name our workflow. In this case, I'm calling it test, build, deploy. Right. So this workflow orchestrates the test and build, and then also deploys the application to Docker Hub as a Docker image. So in this case, we're just deploying our Docker image to Docker Hub to keep it simple. So when we have our test, build, deploy name set, we need to create a jobs list again, right? So again, workflows orchestrates jobs. So what we want to do here is create this jobs list. And once you have that, go ahead and create the actual list of jobs that you want to execute when this workflow gets triggered. So first things first, we want to do a build_test job, right? So that's this job up here, right? We want to make sure that we have that listed because we want to test our application. And that's what you do here. You're going to say, all right, give me a build test job. Once you have that defined, I'm going to collapse this again. We want to execute our build push Docker image. Now, if you noticed, the build test, right, definition within our workflow it looks a little bit different than our build push Docker image definition, right? So I'm listing this build push Docker image job here. But if you notice, it has a requires a statement, right? A requires key. And then it requires build and test. What this basically essentially is doing is creating a dependency, right? So what we're saying with this require statements is this build push Docker image job will not be executed until this build and test job, right, completes successfully. So again, it's adding a sequence or dependency to your build pipeline. Now, workflows, if you didn't have this require statement, workflows would actually execute concurrently or in parallel. So they would run at the same time. In this case, we don't really want that because we don't want to push a busted or bugged, Docker image up to Docker Hub. And that's one way you prevent and control the way you orchestrate your jobs, which is what I was talking about earlier. So now that we have basically the full CircleCI CI/CD pipeline defined, let's go ahead and basically save this configuration and actually execute execute the the pipeline. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to jump over to my terminal and then I'm going to do a git status. So this is how you would trigger a pipeline, right? As I mentioned earlier, right, you have to add a configuration file to your project, and then with every git commit and push upstream to your code repository, your pipeline will execute. So in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and do a git commit statement, and then I know that the file that has changed is CircleCI config, and I want to give it a message. So we're going to do a -m, and here we'll just say created new config .yml file. Once we have that, we're going to go ahead and commit it, and then we're going to do essentially this git push to trigger our CI/CD build pipeline. And if all goes well, we should see something kick off in the dashboard. We're going to push it upstream, and then we're going to jump over to the dashboard. So if I just click back here, CircleCI should detect my changes and then kick off my build pipeline, which it did. In this case, we have our pipeline running. And remember the dependency I talked about? That require statement, obviously, right? It's not kicked off my build push Docker image job yet. But this is essentially what you're looking at, is like the workflow view of the pipeline. So if you jump into the actual job itself, right, which is called build test, as you can see, we've created we executed the job install Python dependencies. It's actually done that, right? Is really cool. And then we kicked off the run test job, which essentially kicks off a quick or a very simple unit test for my application, my Flask application, and it's passed, right? So there's no errors, which is good. If we would have had an error, we would have had a failure, and then it would have stopped the pipeline. So if we go back to our workflow, we can see that our Docker build Docker image job has kicked off. Right now, it's basically building the app binary. And creating that that single binary for my application that I could then load into a Docker image. Now remember when we had the remote Docker image key in our YAML? This is exactly what it does. It kicks off this new Docker image so that we're able to build Docker images within a Docker container. Now here's the Docker login that we use, right? It's actually automatically called. We don't really have to do anything, but the orb does that for you. Here's the Docker build command from our orb, right? So if you want, you can take a look at what's happening under the hood. And again, the orb just encapsulates that functionality and makes it a lot easier to implement within YAML. But the Docker build has succeeded, and then it actually pushed the same image, right? It did the Docker push twice, but it did it twice because it's the same image with different tags. So it's essentially pushing, the first one's pushing the actual image, and then the second one is just pushing the tag because the image already exists in Docker Hub. Now, if we go back to Docker Hub, let's go ahead and look at the general dashboard here. And if we look at our Python CICD workshop image, we actually should see, let me just refresh here. We should see the latest version, which is here, was pushed a minute ago. And again, right, the latest and this version, 163, will match our pipeline, a number which is 163 right here. So again, you know, it's a very simple example of how to implement CI/CD pipelines into your Python application and repositories. But again, right, the goal here is to simply show you how to get started. And, you know, a lot of it just lives in this, obviously, in this CI/CD configuration file. I'll make this available to all of you in the workshop. But essentially, this is the workshop. If you wanted to, you know, recreate this, it's very easy to do. I'll provide the configuration file for the workshop. And if there are any questions, please reach out to me at Punk Data. And I want to thank you all for your time. I look forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you.